When you spend 15 years building an empire only to watch your husband hand it all to his mistress the day you die, death feels like the ultimate betrayal. But when you open your eyes 5 years earlier with all your knowledge intact, you realize the greatest power isn't revenge. It's refusing to build anything he can steal in the first place. My name is Dr. Catherine Moore, and I died at 43 after my husband of 15 years, Dr. James Moore, published our groundbreaking cancer research under his mistress Dr. Sarah Chen's name while I lay dying in a hospital bed from the very disease we'd worked to cure. The last thing I heard before my heart stopped was James telling Sarah, "Don't worry, Catherine's work is yours now. No one will ever know she contributed anything." But when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't dead. I was 38 years old, sitting in my lab at Princeton Medical Research Center, staring at the preliminary data that would become the foundation for our revolutionary treatment protocol. This time, I wasn't going to let James take credit for a single discovery. This time, I was filing for divorce before he could steal 15 more years of my life. I looked down at my hands, younger and steadier than they'd been in my final days, then at the lab notebook in front of me. 5 years of research still ahead. 5 years I'd spent building something beautiful that James had destroyed with a signature and a lie. Not this time. I pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer, someone I hadn't thought I'd need for another decade. "Margaret, it's Catherine Moore. I need to file for divorce immediately. Can you meet me today?" The response came within minutes. "Catherine? Is everything all right? What happened? I'll explain everything. But I need to move fast. Today if possible. Come to my office at 2 p.m. I'll clear my schedule." I looked around my lab. The equipment I'd personally calibrated, the protocols I'd developed, the cell cultures I'd nurtured through countless failed experiments. In my previous timeline, James had convinced me to put his name first on every paper, to let him present our findings at conferences, to position himself as the lead researcher while I did the actual work. "You're too introverted for the spotlight," he'd said. "Let me handle the public-facing aspects. You're the brilliant mind behind everything. Everyone who matters knows that." But everyone who mattered hadn't known. And when the final breakthrough came, when we developed a treatment protocol that could revolutionize cancer care, James had made sure the only name on the patent was Sarah Chen's. My phone buzzed. It was James. "Working late again? Don't forget we have dinner with the Richardsons tonight." I stared at the message, remembering hundreds just like it from my previous life. James constantly scheduling social events with potential investors and board members, always positioning himself as the face of our research while I stayed late in the lab doing the actual work. I typed back, "I'll be home at 5. We need to talk." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, "About what?" "In person." I didn't wait for his response. Instead, I carefully documented everything in my lab notebook, made copies of all my current research, and backed up every file to my personal encrypted cloud storage. In my previous life, I kept everything in shared folders that James had access to. This time, I was protecting my work from the start. At exactly 5 p.m., I walked into our upscale apartment in downtown Princeton. James was in the kitchen, pouring wine, an expensive Cabernet we usually saved for celebrations. "You're actually home on time," he said with that charming smile I'd once found irresistible. "I thought we could talk over a glass of wine before we get ready for dinner." "We're not going to dinner," I said flatly. "And I'm not drinking wine with you." James's smile faltered. "Catherine, what's wrong? You've been acting strange all day. That text. I'm filing for divorce." The wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. "What? I'm divorcing you, James. I've already contacted my lawyer." He set the glass down carefully, his expression shifting from shock to concern. "Catherine, where is this coming from? Are you feeling all right? Has something happened?" "What's happening is that I'm done," I said. "Done with this marriage. Done with you taking credit for my work. Done with pretending I don't see what you really are." "Taking credit for your work?" James's voice rose. "Catherine, we're partners. Everything we do together. What are you even talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that my name is never first on any of our papers. I'm talking about you presenting findings at conferences that I developed. I'm talking about you spending more time managing your image than doing actual research. James laughed, but it sounded forced. This is ridiculous. You're the one who prefers to stay out of the spotlight. I'm just doing what you asked, handling the public-facing aspects while you focus on the science. No, I said quietly. You're taking my work and making it yours. And I'm not going to let it continue. Catherine, you sound paranoid, James said, his tone shifting to something patronizing. Have you been sleeping? The stress of the research. Maybe you need to take a break. There it was. The gaslighting I'd endured for years without recognizing it for what it was. In my previous life, I'd second-guess myself every time James made me feel crazy for noticing his manipulation. I'm perfectly sane, I said. And I'm done with this conversation. The papers will be served tomorrow. Wait, James said, his voice hardening. You can't just divorce me. What about the research? What about our work? Our work. I raised an eyebrow. That's interesting phrasing. Because from what I can see, I do the work and you take the credit. That's not true and you know it, James snapped. I contribute just as much. Name one protocol I didn't develop. Name one breakthrough that was your idea. Name one experiment you ran without my guidance. James's face flushed red. I handle the administrative aspects, the funding, the institutional relationships. That's just as important as lab work. Then you should have no problem continuing that work without me, I said. Because as of right now, we're separating our research. Everything I've developed stays with me. Everything you've developed, if there is anything, stays with you. You can't do that, James said. Our research is joint intellectual property. The university will find that I've been meticulous about documentation, I interrupted. Every protocol, every breakthrough, every innovative technique, there's a clear paper trail showing who actually developed it. James's expression turned ugly. You've been planning this. How long? Does it matter? Catherine, he said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. If you do this, you'll destroy both our careers. Do you understand that? The academic community doesn't look kindly on messy divorces. People will take sides. Funding will dry up. All the work we've done. All the work I've done, I corrected. And I'm willing to take that risk. Are you? James stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out his next move. In my previous timeline, this was when he'd started his affair with Sarah Chun, a younger, more malleable researcher he could control and manipulate. But I didn't care anymore. Let him have Sarah. Let him try to build a career on someone else's work. This time, I wasn't going to be his stepping stone. I need you to leave, I said. Tonight. Stay with a friend, stay at a hotel. I don't care. But I want you out of this apartment. This is my apartment too, James said. Then I'll leave, I replied. Either way, we're not staying under the same roof tonight. I grabbed my laptop bag and walked toward the bedroom to pack essentials. James followed me, his voice rising. Catherine, you're making a huge mistake. You need me. Who's going to present your research? Who's going to secure funding? Who's going to navigate the politics of academia? I turned to face him. I am. And I should have been doing it all along. You can't, James said flatly. You don't have the social skills, the connections, the presence. You're brilliant in the lab, but you're terrible at everything else. Without me, you'll fail. Those words, I'd heard variations of them for years, had internalized them until I believed I really was incompetent at anything outside the lab. But now, with the clarity of having lived through the consequences, I could see them for what they were. Lies designed to keep me dependent. Then I'll fail on my own terms, I said. Which is better than succeeding as your ghost writer. I finished packing and walked toward the door. James grabbed my arm. Don't do this, he said, and for the first time, I heard genuine desperation in his voice. Catherine, please. We can work this out. If you're feeling undervalued, we can adjust how we present the research. I can put your name first on the next paper. The next paper? I pulled my arm free. James, there is no next paper. Not with you. Whatever I discover from here on belongs to me alone. You'll never make it without me, James said, his voice cold. You'll see. You're nothing without my support. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what I'd been too blind to see before. A mediocre researcher who'd built his entire reputation on my work. An insecure man who needed to diminish me to feel important. A manipulator who'd spent 15 years convincing me I was lucky to have him. We'll see, I said and walked out. I spent that night in a hotel, lying awake and processing everything. In my previous life, I'd died without ever standing up to James, without ever claiming my own work, without ever realizing how thoroughly he'd stolen my identity along with my research. This time was going to be different. The next morning, I arrived at Margaret's office at exactly 2 p.m. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd handled several high-profile academic divorces. "Catherine," she said, shaking my hand. "I have to admit, I'm surprised. I've met you and James at several university functions. You always seemed like such a solid couple." "Appearances can be deceiving," I said. "Clearly. Now tell me everything." I spent the next 2 hours laying out the situation. James's systematic appropriation of my work, his manipulation and gaslighting, his positioning of himself as the primary researcher while I did the actual science. I showed her documentation proving that I'd developed every major protocol and breakthrough in our research. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she said, "This is actually more straightforward than many cases I handle. The documentation is clear. You have a strong case for intellectual property claims beyond just the divorce itself." "I don't want to fight over the research," I said. "I just want a clean break. He can keep whatever reputation he's built. I'll build my own." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. "You could make a substantial claim for his current position, his grants, everything he's achieved using your work." "I'm sure," I said. "I don't want anything from him except my freedom and my future research." Margaret nodded. "Then we'll file for a no-fault divorce with clear intellectual property boundaries going forward. All research you develop from this point is yours alone. All shared research up to now will be documented as joint work, but you'll both sign agreements not to use the other's subsequent work without explicit permission." "Perfect. There's one thing you should know," Margaret said carefully. "Divorces in the academic world can get ugly. James may try to damage your reputation. He may reach out to colleagues, to the university administration, to funding bodies. You need to be prepared for that." "I am," I said. "I'd lived through worse. I'd lived through dying while James handed my life's work to his mistress." The divorce papers were served the next day. James's response was exactly what I expected. A flurry of calls and texts, alternating between pleading and threats, between promises to change and accusations of betrayal. I blocked his number and focused on my work. Within a week, the gossip had spread through the department. I could feel eyes on me in the hallways, hear whispers stop when I entered rooms. Several colleagues approached me with carefully worded questions about what happened, and if there was anything they could do. The department chair, Dr. Robert Harrison, called me into his office. "Dr. Moore," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to check in with you about this situation with Dr. Moore." "James, it's a personal matter," I said. "It won't affect my research." Of course," Harrison said, but his expression suggested otherwise. "It's just that the two of you have been such a successful partnership. Your joint research has brought significant prestige to the department. We're concerned about how this separation might impact future work." "My research will continue," I said firmly. "The quality will remain high. The only difference is that I'll be working independently." Harrison frowned. "Catherine, I don't want to seem insensitive, but James has been the public face of your research team. He has relationships with key funding bodies, with pharmaceutical companies, with academic journals. Are you prepared to take on those responsibilities?" "I am. Because if you're not," Harrison continued, "we might need to consider restructuring. Perhaps bringing in a senior researcher to partner with you, someone who can handle the administrative and networking aspects." "No," I said. "I don't need a partner. I can handle all aspects of my research independently." Harrison looked skeptical. "Catherine, you're an exceptional scientist. No one doubts that. But you've always preferred to work behind the scenes. Taking on a more public role is a significant change. Are you certain you're ready for that? I recognized the subtext. Without James, I was being viewed as less capable, less credible, less worthy of independent research status. In my previous life, I would have accepted this judgment, would have agreed to whatever restructuring the department suggested. Not this time. Dr. Harrison, I said clearly. I've been the lead researcher on every project James and I worked on. I developed the protocols, ran the experiments, analyzed the data, and wrote the papers. James's role was primarily presentation and networking. Those are skills I can develop. But his skills couldn't replace mine. Can the same be said in reverse? Harrison's expression tightened. That's not how James describes your working relationship. I'm sure it's not, I said. But my lab notebooks tell a different story. Would you like to review them? There was a long pause. Finally, Harrison said, that won't be necessary. But Catherine, I want to be clear. The department expects high-quality research and successful grant applications. If your productivity declines or if you're unable to secure funding, it won't decline, I said. In fact, I expect it to increase now that I won't be spending time explaining my work to someone else so he can present it as his own. I stood to leave. Harrison looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. Over the following weeks, I discovered that James had been more active in spreading his version of events than I'd anticipated. Several colleagues who'd been friendly before started avoiding me. A major grant I'd been working on suddenly had additional concerns that needed to be addressed. A paper I'd submitted for publication was returned with unusual criticism. I realized that James was using every connection he'd built, connections built on my work, to undermine me. The low point came when I received an email from Dr. Patricia Chun at Stanford, a researcher I'd collaborated with remotely on a project last year. The email was brief and cold. Dr. Moore, I've been informed by Dr. James Moore that you are experiencing some personal difficulties that may be affecting your judgment and professional reliability. Given these concerns, I think it would be best if we discontinued our collaboration for the time being. I wish you well. I stared at the email, fury building in my chest. James was actively sabotaging my professional relationships, telling people I was unstable, unreliable, going through some kind of breakdown. In my previous life, this kind of attack would have destroyed me. But now, with the knowledge of what James was really capable of, with the clarity of having lived through his ultimate betrayal, I wasn't going to fold. I replied to Dr. Chun. Dr. Chun, I appreciate your concern. However, I think you should know that Dr. James Moore and I are divorcing, and he appears to be spreading false information about my mental state as part of that process. I am not experiencing any difficulties that affect my work. In fact, my research productivity has increased since separating from Dr. Moore. I would welcome the opportunity to continue our collaboration, but I understand if you prefer to wait until the divorce is finalized and you can better assess the situation. Regardless, I hope you'll verify information you receive about me directly rather than accepting it secondhand from someone who has a vested interest in damaging my reputation. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Dr. Chen's response came the next day. Dr. Moore, thank you for your direct communication. I appreciate your clarification. I would indeed like to continue our collaboration. Perhaps we can schedule a video call to discuss next steps. Small victory but important. James's whisper campaign would only work if I let it. I decided it was time to go on offense. I scheduled meetings with every major collaborator, every funding body, every journal editor I'd worked with. I presented my research clearly and confidently, making it obvious through detailed discussions that I was the one who truly understood the work at a deep level. I submitted new grant applications under my name alone, with clear documentation of my previous contributions to the field. Most importantly, I started presenting my work publicly. I'd been terrified of public speaking in my previous life, had let James handle all presentations because I convinced myself I couldn't do it. But I'd died regretting that fear, had watched my work be stolen because I'd been too afraid to claim it publicly. This time, I pushed through the fear. My first solo presentation was at a regional medical research conference 3 months after filing for divorce. I was terrified, my hands shaking as I loaded my slides, my voice uncertain as I began speaking. But as I got into the material, my research, my discoveries, something shifted. I wasn't reciting someone else's interpretation of my work. I was explaining my own ideas in my own words, and I knew every detail, every nuance, every implication. The questions from the audience were sharp, but I had answers. Real answers, not the vague generalities James had always offered when pressed on technical details. After the presentation, several researchers approached me. Dr. Moore, that was fascinating. I'd love to learn more about your protocol development process. Dr. Moore, would you be interested in collaborating on a related project? Dr. Moore, I have to say, your work is even more impressive when you present it yourself. I've heard James present some of this before, but you have a much deeper understanding of the implications. That last comment came from Dr. Richard Martinez, a prominent researcher I'd admired for years. He studied my face carefully, then added, I always wondered who was really driving that research. Now I know. Word spread. Within 6 months, my reputation as an independent researcher began to solidify. I secured 2 major grants, published 3 papers as sole author, and was invited to speak at a prestigious international conference. Meanwhile, James's career was stagnating. Without me to do the actual work, he couldn't produce new research. He tried to partner with other researchers, including Sarah Chun, but his lack of technical depth quickly became apparent to anyone who worked closely with him. The final vindication came a year after I filed for divorce. I published a breakthrough paper on a novel cancer treatment protocol, work I'd been developing since the divorce, work that was entirely mine. The paper was accepted by one of the top journals in the field and generated immediate interest from pharmaceutical companies. The treatment protocol was the same one that, in my previous timeline, James had credited to Sarah Chun. This time, my name was the only one on the patent. 2 weeks after the paper published, I received a call from Dr. Harrison. Catherine, he said, his voice notably warmer than our last conversation. I wanted to congratulate you on your recent publication. It's extraordinary work. Thank you, I said neutrally. I also wanted to apologize, Harrison continued. I underestimated you when you and James separated. I assumed that he was the driving force behind your joint research. I was wrong. Yes, I said. You were. There was a pause. Then Harrison said, We'd like to offer you a promotion. Full professor with your own research group and increased lab space. We want to make sure you stay at Princeton. I thought about my previous life, how I'd died as a senior researcher, never promoted because James had always been positioned as the lead investigator. How I'd done the work while he'd reaped the rewards. I'll consider it, I said. But I have some conditions. Name them. I want complete independence. No partnerships forced on me. No oversight beyond standard department requirements. And I want it in writing that my research is mine alone. No one else gets credit for my work without explicit written permission from me. Done, Harrison said immediately. Catherine, I hope you know we value you. We want to support your research. I almost laughed. They valued my research now that it was clearly, undeniably mine. When James had been positioning himself as the lead researcher, when he'd been taking credit for my work, the department had been happy to let that narrative stand. I'll have my lawyer review the offer, I said. I'll let you know my decision. The divorce was finalized 2 months later. James fought it every step of the way, trying to claim shared credit for my ongoing research, trying to argue that he deserved ongoing access to my protocols and data. But Margaret was excellent, and my documentation was thorough. The judge ruled clearly. All future research was separate and independent. On the day the divorce was finalized, I felt lighter than I had in years, in 2 lifetimes. I'd reclaimed my work, my reputation, and most importantly, my identity as a researcher in my own right. I never saw James again after that day in court. I heard through the grapevine that he'd left Princeton for a smaller institution where his lack of research productivity would be less noticeable. Sarah Chun apparently had also left. She'd figured out pretty quickly that James had nothing to offer without me doing the work. 5 years after my rebirth, the same year I would have died in my previous timeline, I was invited to speak at the Nobel Prize ceremony. Not as a winner, but as a keynote speaker whose breakthrough cancer treatment had led to another researcher's prize-winning work. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the audience of the world's top scientists, I thought about my previous life. About dying in a hospital bed while James stole my work. About spending 15 years building something beautiful only to have it destroyed by a man I'd trusted. This time I'd built something just as beautiful, but it was mine. Completely, undeniably solely mine. And no one could ever take that away. I began my speech. Distinguished guests, fellow researchers, I want to talk to you today about what it means to claim your own work. Throughout history, brilliant scientists, especially women scientists, have seen their discoveries credited to others. Rosalind Franklin and the structure of DNA, Lise Meitner and nuclear fission, Jocelyn Bell Burnell and pulsars. The list goes on. I want to tell you that I almost became another name on that list. I almost let someone take credit for my work, because I believed I wasn't capable of presenting it, wasn't deserving of recognition, wasn't strong enough to stand in the spotlight alone. But I learned something crucial. The person who does the work deserves the credit. Not the person who presents it. Not the person who networks. Not the person who has better social skills or more charisma or more connections. The person who does the work deserves the credit. And if you're doing work that someone else is taking credit for, you have two choices. Accept it, or fight for what's rightfully yours. I chose to fight. And I want every young researcher here, especially the women, to know that you can fight too. You can claim your work. You can build a reputation based on your actual contributions, rather than someone else's narrative. Your work is yours. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. The audience applauded, and I saw several young women researchers nodding, their expressions determined. I hoped that my story would give them courage to fight for their own recognition. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous but determined. "Dr. Moore," she said, "I wanted to thank you for your speech. I'm in a situation similar to what you described. My advisor is taking credit for my research, and I didn't know if I should say anything or just accept it as part of paying my dues." I looked at her carefully. "How much of the work is yours?" "All of it," she said. "I developed the protocols, ran the experiments, analyzed the data. He just presents it and puts his name first on the papers because he's the principal investigator." "Then document everything," I said. "Keep detailed records of your contributions. Back up everything. And when you're ready, claim your work. Don't wait until it's too late." "But won't that damage my career? Everyone says you need to stay on good terms with your advisor." "Staying silent will damage your career more," I interrupted. "Trust me. I learned that the hard way." The young woman nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. Thank you, Dr. Moore." As I watched her walk away, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in my previous life. Yes, I'd reclaimed my own work and built a successful career. But more than that, I was helping others avoid the trap I'd almost fallen into permanently. I thought about James, about how small he seemed now compared to the giant he'd been in my mind for so many years. I thought about how I'd let him convince me I was nothing without him, how I'd almost accepted that narrative until death had given me a second chance to write a different story. The greatest revenge, I discovered, wasn't destroying James's career or exposing his theft. It was succeeding so thoroughly on my own that his manipulation became irrelevant. It was building something so undeniably mine that no one could question who deserved the credit. It was living well. That night, I called Margaret, who had become a friend during the divorce process. "I wanted to thank you," I told her, "for helping me reclaim my life." "You reclaimed it yourself," Margaret said. "I just filed the paperwork. Still, I couldn't have done it without your support." "Catherine, can I ask you something? You've never really explained what triggered your decision to divorce James. One day you seemed fine, the next you were in my office demanding an immediate divorce. What changed?" I thought about how to answer. I couldn't tell her the truth, that I'd died, been reborn, and decided to change my fate. So instead I said, I had a moment of clarity. I saw exactly where my life was headed if I stayed with James, and I realized I couldn't accept that future. So I changed it. "That takes incredible courage," Margaret said. Or incredible desperation, I replied. Sometimes they're the same thing. 10 years after my rebirth, I had accomplished everything I'd failed to achieve in my previous life. Multiple breakthrough publications, several patents, a thriving research group of young scientists I was mentoring, and a reputation as one of the leading cancer researchers in the world. I'd also remained single. Several colleagues had asked me out over the years, but I'd declined. I'd learned that I didn't need a partner to validate my work or complete my identity. I was whole on my own. One evening, I was working late in my lab. Some things never changed, when I received an unexpected email. It was from James. I stared at his name in my inbox, debating whether to delete it unread. But curiosity won. Catherine, I know I have no right to contact you, and I'll understand if you delete this without reading. But I wanted to reach out because I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about our marriage and how it ended. I was wrong. About so many things. I took credit for your work. I diminished your contributions. I convinced you, and myself, that I was the important one, the face of our research, the one who made it all possible. But I've spent the last 10 years watching your career flourish while mine stagnated, and I finally understand the truth. You were always the brilliant one. I was just good at talking about your brilliance as if it were mine. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I recognize now what I refused to see then. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too insecure to admit that you were smarter, more talented, and more capable than I would ever be. You were right to leave. I hope you're happy. James. I read the email twice feeling nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no vindication. Just a mild curiosity about what had prompted this confession after so many years. I considered responding, considered telling him exactly what I thought of his apology. But in the end, I simply deleted the email and returned to my work. James's recognition of his wrongs didn't matter. His apology didn't matter. His opinion of me had never mattered. I'd just been too trapped in his manipulation to see that. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the young researchers I was mentoring to claim their own discoveries. What mattered was the cancer patients whose lives would be saved by the treatment protocol I'd developed. What mattered was that I'd taken a second chance at life and used it to become everything I was meant to be, without letting anyone diminish me or steal my achievements. That was the real victory. As I pipette samples into test tubes, my hands steady and sure, I thought about the choice I'd made 10 years ago to divorce James immediately after my rebirth. It had seemed impulsive, even reckless. Everyone had questioned my decision. But it had been the right choice. Not because it led to fame or recognition or success, though it had led to all of those things. It had been the right choice because it had been mine. I had chosen myself. I had chosen my work. I had chosen a life where I would never again let someone convince me I was less than I was. And that choice had made all the difference. The future I'd died into in my previous life, where James took everything and I died with nothing, that future no longer existed. I'd erased it with a single decision. To value myself enough to walk away from someone who didn't. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting for a relationship. Sometimes it's having the strength to end one. To stand alone. To rebuild from nothing because you know that nothing is better than living as someone's ghost. I had been Catherine Moore, the invisible researcher behind James Moore's success. I had died as Catherine Moore, the woman whose work was stolen by her husband. But I had been reborn as Dr. Catherine Moore, a researcher whose name stood on its own, whose work was undeniably hers, whose legacy would be measured by her contributions rather than someone else's appropriation. And I had never been happier.